In the year 1415, on a muddy field in northern France, something extraordinary happened that would shake the foundations of medieval warfare forever. A small English army, outnumbered more than 3 to 1, faced the flower of French nobility. Thousands of heavily armored knights on horseback, the elite warriors who had dominated European battlefields for centuries. But standing in their way were roughly 5,000 English and Welsh soldiers, most of them carrying simple wooden bows nearly as tall as themselves. These weren't noble knights or wealthy men-at-arms. They were commoners, farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who had learned to shoot from childhood. Yet, in the space of a few hours, these humble archers would slaughter the cream of French aristocracy and prove that the age of heavy cavalry was coming to an end. This was the Battle of Agincourt, perhaps the most famous victory in English military history. But it wasn't a fluke or a lucky accident. For over 2 centuries, from roughly 1250 to 1450, English longbowmen dominated European battlefields with a weapon that was both devastatingly simple and incredibly effective. They didn't just win battles, they terrorized entire nations and changed the course of medieval warfare. Today we're going to discover why a piece of wood and string became one of the most feared weapons in medieval Europe. We'll explore how English longbowmen were trained, how they fought, and why their enemies learned to dread the sound of thousands of arrows darkening the sky. This is the story of the weapon that helped England punch far above its weight in medieval Europe and earned its archers a reputation that lasted for centuries. The English longbow wasn't actually English in origin. The weapon first appeared in Wales, where the native population had been using powerful bows for hunting and warfare for generations. These Welsh bows were significantly different from the shorter, weaker bows used elsewhere in Europe. They stood about 6 feet tall, roughly the same height as the men who used them, and were carved from a single piece of yew wood. What made the Welsh bow special wasn't just its size, but its incredible power. While most European bows could only shoot arrows effectively at short range, the Welsh longbow could send a heavy arrow over 200 yards with enough force to punch through armor. When English armies invaded Wales in the 12th and 13th centuries, they got a painful introduction to this weapon's capabilities. The Welsh didn't fight like other medieval armies. Instead of meeting the English in open battle with heavy cavalry, Welsh archers would strike from concealed positions, sending volleys of arrows into English formations before disappearing into the hills. English knights found their expensive armor was no protection against arrows shot from these powerful bows. Horses were killed, men were wounded or killed despite their protection, and entire military campaigns ground to a halt because of harassment by Welsh bowmen, smart English. Commanders quickly realized they were dealing with something revolutionary. Instead of just trying to defeat the Welsh, they began recruiting them. Welsh archers were offered good pay, regular food, and the chance to fight for the winning side. Many accepted, bringing their bows and their skills into English service. By the early 1300s, English armies routinely included large numbers of Welsh longbowmen. But the English didn't stop there. They began training their own people to use these weapons, establishing archery as a national skill that every able-bodied man was expected to develop. Laws were passed requiring regular archery practice. Competitions were held to identify the best shooters. What had started as a Welsh tribal weapon became the foundation of English military power. The longbow itself was a masterpiece of medieval technology, though it looked deceptively simple. Creating an effective longbow required selecting the right piece of yew wood, a tree that grows slowly and develops incredibly dense, strong wood. The bowyer, or bowmaker, had to understand how the wood's grain affected its strength and flexibility. He had to shape the bow so that it bent evenly along its entire length, storing and releasing energy efficiently. A finished warbow was a formidable weapon. It stood between 5 and 6 feet tall and required enormous strength to draw properly. The draw weight, The amount of force needed to pull the string back fully ranged from 100 to 180 pounds. To put this in perspective, modern hunting bows typically have draw weights of 40–70 pounds. Medieval longbowmen were pulling back the equivalent of lifting a full-grown man with their arms and shoulders. This incredible power gave the longbow its legendary range and penetrating ability. A skilled archer could accurately hit targets at 150–200 yards, and arrows could travel much further than that. More importantly, the heavy arrows shot from these powerful bows could penetrate most types of medieval armor. Chainmail offered little protection, and even plate armor could be pierced at close range or if the arrow struck at the right angle. The arrows themselves were carefully designed for maximum effectiveness. War arrows were typically 30–36 inches long, made from ash or birchwood, and fitted with steel points designed for different purposes. Bodkin points were narrow and sharp, designed to pierce armor. Broadheads were wider and designed to cause maximum damage to unarmored targets. The fletching, the feathers at the back of the arrow, was carefully matched to ensure the arrow flew straight and true, but the weapon was only as good as the man using it, and this is where the English developed their most significant advantage. Training a longbowman took years. Some historians estimate it required a decade or more to develop the strength, skill, and accuracy needed for effective battlefield shooting. The English solved this problem by making archery a national obsession. Laws passed in the 14th century required every able-bodied man between the ages of 15 and 60 to own a bow and practice regularly. Archery competitions were held in every town and village, with prizes awarded to the best shooters. Church festivals included archery contests. Young boys started training as soon as they were strong enough to draw a bow, gradually working up to more powerful weapons as they grew stronger. This wasn't just about individual skill. It was about creating a military culture centered on the longbow. English society produced thousands of men who could shoot accurately under pressure, who understood how to work together in large formations, and who saw archery as both a practical skill and a source of personal pride. No other European nation developed anything comparable to this archery tradition. The physical demands of longbow shooting created a distinctive type of warrior. Archaeologists have found medieval skeletons that show the characteristic bone changes of lifelong archers: enlarged left arms from holding the bow, overdeveloped back and shoulder muscles from drawing heavy bows thousands of times, and sometimes even twisted spines from the asymmetrical stresses of archery. These men were shaped by their weapon as much as they shaped its use. Training didn't end with learning to shoot accurately. Military archery required skills that went far beyond what hunters or sports shooters needed. Battlefield archers had to shoot rapidly while under pressure, often while enemy cavalry was charging directly at them. They had to coordinate their shooting with hundreds or thousands of other archers, timing their volleys for maximum effect. They had to judge distances accurately in the heat of battle and adjust their aim for wind, terrain, and the movement of targets. Most importantly, they had to maintain their nerve. Facing a charge by heavy cavalry, armored knights on powerful horses, thundering across the battlefield at full speed, required incredible courage and discipline. The natural human instinct is to run when hundreds of armed horsemen are bearing down on you. Longbowmen had to stand their ground, continue shooting until the last possible moment, and trust that their arrows would stop the charge before it reached them. The English developed sophisticated tactics that maximized the effectiveness of massed longbow fire. Instead of scattering their archers throughout the army, they concentrated them in large formations that could deliver coordinated volleys. 1,000 archers shooting together could put 6,000 arrows in the air in a single minute. A devastating storm of steel that few enemy formations could survive. These tactics were first perfected during the Scottish Wars of Independence in the early 1300s. English armies learned to use their longbowmen as the primary striking force, with heavy cavalry and infantry playing supporting roles rather than leading the attack. This was a revolutionary change from traditional medieval warfare, where mounted knights were the dominant force and archers played a secondary role. The key to English success was combining concentrated archery with defensive tactics that forced enemies to attack on English terms. English commanders became masters at choosing battlefields that favored their longbowmen, open ground where cavalry charges could be seen coming from far away, terrain that channeled enemy attacks into predictable paths, positions that gave the archers clear fields of fire while providing some protection from enemy missiles. Stakes were often planted in front of archery positions to break up cavalry charges. These were sharpened wooden poles angled toward the enemy, creating a barrier that horses couldn't easily cross. The stakes didn't stop determined attackers, but they slowed them down and disrupted their formations, giving the archers more time to shoot and making the cavalry more vulnerable. The psychological impact of massed archery was as important as its physical effects. The sound of thousands of bowstrings releasing simultaneously, followed by the whistle of arrows through the air, was terrifying to men and horses alike. Cavalry. Charges depended on momentum and morale, horses and riders moving together at high speed with absolute confidence in their ability to break through enemy lines. The constant threat of arrow fire disrupted this momentum and undermined the confidence that made cavalry charges effective. Even when arrows didn't kill or wound, they could disable horses, damage equipment, or force attackers to take cover rather than pressing home their attacks. A knight whose horse was killed or wounded was suddenly much less dangerous. A man-at-arms who had to advance on foot while under constant arrow fire was at a severe disadvantage compared to troops who could approach fresh and ready for battle. The English didn't rely solely on archery, but they made it the centerpiece of their military system. Men-at-arms fought dismounted alongside the archers, providing close protection against enemies who survived the arrow storm. Light cavalry was used for reconnaissance and pursuit, rather than frontal attacks. The entire army was organized around maximizing the effectiveness of the longbow while minimizing its weaknesses. This system proved devastatingly effective against traditional medieval armies that were built around heavy cavalry. French, Scottish, and other European forces found themselves repeatedly defeated by English armies that used tactics and weapons they had never encountered before. Battles that should have been easy, victories for superior numbers of well-equipped knights, turned into disasters when faced with massed longbow fire. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 provided the first major demonstration of English longbow tactics against a European army. King Edward III faced a much larger French force that included thousands of knights and crossbowmen. The English took a defensive position on a hill and waited for the French to attack. When the assault came, English longbowmen destroyed the Genoese crossbowmen supporting the French knights, then turned their attention to the cavalry. The French launched repeated charges against the English position, but each attack was broken up by arrow fire before it could reach the English lines. Knights and horses fell in heaps as volleys of arrows found their targets. Those who did reach the English position found themselves facing fresh men-at-arms who had been protected throughout the battle, while the attackers were exhausted, demoralized, and reduced in numbers. The battle was a complete disaster for the French. Thousands of their best knights and soldiers were killed or wounded, while English losses were minimal. The cream of French nobility lay dead on the field, killed not in honorable single combat, but by arrows shot by common soldiers whose names would never be recorded in the chronicles of chivalry. Crécy established the pattern that would be repeated in English victories for the next century. Superior English tactics and weapons overcame superior enemy numbers and equipment. The longbow had proven it could dominate medieval battlefields when used properly, and English armies had proven they knew how to use it properly. The most famous longbow victory came at Agincourt in 1415 during Henry V's invasion of France. The English army was tired, sick, and heavily outnumbered by a fresh French force that was determined to avenge earlier defeats. The battle seemed to offer the French an ideal opportunity to prove that English victories had been flukes that wouldn't be repeated against a properly prepared enemy. The French plan was sound in theory. They would attack with dismounted men-at-arms who couldn't be stopped by killing their horses. They would advance in dense formations that could absorb arrow casualties and still have enough men to reach the English lines. They would use the bow, muddy conditions, to slow down any English counterattack. Everything seemed to favor the defenders of French honor, but the reality was different. The French advance across muddy fields was slow and exhausting, giving English archers plenty of time to shoot. The dense formations that were supposed to absorb casualties instead made perfect targets for concentrated archery. Men fell faster than they could be replaced, and the survivors reached the English lines exhausted and demoralized. The mud that was supposed to help the French actually helped the English. French knights in full armor found it almost impossible to move quickly or maneuver effectively in the heavy, sticky mud. English archers, more lightly equipped and fighting from prepared positions, had much less difficulty. When the archery was finished and the hand-to-hand fighting began, the French were at a severe disadvantage. The battle ended with another crushing English victory. Thousands of French nobles were killed or captured at a cost of perhaps a few. Dozen English dead. Henry V had won one of the most lopsided victories in medieval warfare, and the longbow had once again proven its devastating effectiveness against the flower of European chivalry. But Agincourt was more than just another English victory. It was a cultural earthquake that reverberated throughout Europe. The idea that common archers could slaughter noble knights challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and military effectiveness. If birth and expensive equipment couldn't guarantee victory in battle, what did that mean for the entire system of medieval society? The psychological impact of English longbow victories went far beyond their immediate military consequences. European nobles had built their entire identity around their supposed superiority as warriors. They justified their wealth, power, and privileges by claiming they were better fighters than common people. The longbow shattered this myth by proving that a well-trained commoner with a simple weapon could kill the most expensively equipped knight. This had profound social and political implications. If military effectiveness didn't depend on noble birth and expensive equipment, then maybe political power shouldn't either. The longbow victories contributed to changing attitudes about social hierarchy, military organization, and the relationship between rulers and ruled throughout Europe. The English themselves were well aware of the revolutionary nature of their military success. Longbowmen became folk heroes in English culture, celebrated in ballads, stories, and popular entertainment. Robin Hood, the most famous archer in English folklore, represented the idea that a skilled bowman could challenge authority and fight for justice. Whether or not Robin Hood was based on a real person, the stories reflected English pride in their archery tradition. This cultural celebration of archery reinforced the military system that made English armies so effective. Young men grew up hearing stories about famous archers and dreaming of winning glory with their bows. Communities took pride in producing skilled archers who could serve in the king's armies. Archery wasn't just a military skill, it was part of English national identity. The longbow also changed how wars were fought throughout Europe. Other nations tried to copy English tactics with varying degrees of success. Some adopted similar bows and training methods, though none achieved the same level of systematic excellence as the English. Others developed new tactics and weapons designed to counter longbow-equipped armies, crossbows became more popular as alternatives to longbows, since they required less training and could be used effectively by soldiers who hadn't spent years developing archery skills. Early firearms were developed partly as responses to the dominance of English archery. Artillery became more important as armies looked for ways to suppress archer formations from long range, but for over a century, no European power found a completely effective answer to English longbow tactics. The weapon and the system built around it gave England a military advantage that lasted from the early 1300s through the mid-1400s, allowing a relatively small and poor country to defeat much larger and wealthier enemies repeatedly. The longbow's military dominance couldn't last forever. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, new weapons and tactics gradually made traditional archery less effective. Improved armor provided better protection against arrows. Better crossbows and early firearms offered alternatives that didn't require years of training. Changes in military organization and tactics reduced the opportunities for the kind of defensive battles where longbows were most effective. Perhaps most importantly, the social and economic changes that made longbow armies possible began to disappear. The feudal system that had defined medieval society was breaking down, replaced by more centralized monarchies with professional armies. Kings preferred soldiers who could be trained quickly and equipped uniformly, rather than maintaining the complex social systems needed to produce generations of skilled archers. The English themselves began to lose their archery tradition as society changed. Urban growth meant fewer people lived in rural areas where archery skills were traditionally developed. Economic changes gave people other ways to make a living besides serving as soldiers. The rise of professional armies meant that military service became a specialized career rather than a part-time obligation for all citizens. By the late 1400s, English armies were beginning to look more like other European forces, with professional soldiers using a mix of weapons rather than relying primarily on longbows. The weapon that had given England its greatest military victories was gradually being relegated to hunting, sport, and ceremony, rather than warfare. But the impact of the English longbow extended far beyond its active period of military use. The weapon had demonstrated that technological and tactical innovation could overcome traditional military advantages. It had shown that properly organized common soldiers could defeat elite warriors. It had proven that a small nation with superior weapons and tactics could compete with much larger powers. These lessons influenced military thinking for centuries after the last longbow was used in serious warfare. The idea that superior training and organization could compensate for numerical disadvantages became a standard part of military doctrine. The concept that new weapons could revolutionize warfare encouraged continued innovation in military technology. The longbow also left its mark on English culture and identity. The idea of English military excellence, the tradition of citizen soldiers rather than professional armies, and the belief that individual skill and courage could overcome superior numbers all had roots in the longbow period. These cultural attitudes influenced English military and political thinking well into the modern era. Even today, the English longbow remains a symbol of English military prowess and a reminder of a time when England dominated European battlefields despite being outnumbered and outspent by its enemies. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new information about how these weapons were made and used, while experimental archaeology allows modern researchers to test theories about longbow capabilities and tactics. The story of the English longbow is ultimately about more than just a weapon. It's about how technological innovation, systematic training, and tactical brilliance can combine to create military advantages that last for generations. It's about how a simple piece of wood and string in the hands of properly trained soldiers using effective tactics could terrorize the most powerful armies in Europe and change the course of medieval history. For over 2 centuries, the sound of English bowstrings releasing thousands of arrows simultaneously was one of the most feared sounds on European battlefields. Kings and generals learned to dread facing English armies, knowing that their expensive knights and men-at-arms might be slaughtered by common archers before they could even reach the enemy lines. The English longbow earned its fearsome reputation through devastating effectiveness in battle after battle, from the Scottish border wars through the great victories of the 100 Years' War. It represented a revolution in military affairs that helped transform medieval warfare and contributed to the eventual end of the age of chivalry. Today, as we study this remarkable weapon and the men who used it, we can still appreciate why English longbowmen were feared across Europe. They had mastered a weapon that combined simplicity with devastating power, developed tactics that maximized its effectiveness, and created a military tradition that produced victory after victory against seemingly impossible odds. They proved that in warfare, as in so many other human endeavors, skill and innovation can triumph over wealth and tradition, and that's a lesson that remains relevant today.